Greetings. Welcome to the DragonCon Urban Fantasy Track author interview series. I'm joined today by the wonderful longtime friend of the track, David B. Coe, or DB Jackson, however you happen to know him. I knew you first as David, so that is how I will. Since that's your actual name,
Yes.
I will refer to you as David. But thank you so much for being here, David. It's always great to see you at con, but this will give me a chance to ask a lot of questions I haven't gotten to ask you before. So I appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here and always happy to do something for DragonCon. DragonCon is always the highlight of my professional calendar every year. So
that's good to hear. That's good to hear. We appreciate it. Believe me. Now, to get us started, my first question for most people and for you as well is, did you actually read a lot of, or were you into it in any format, fantasy and or science fiction when you were either a child or a young adult?
Yes. Yeah, I did. Actually, it's funny how I came to it. I went to sleepaway camp when I was 11 years old for the first time. And this was back when these days kids go to sleepaway camp for like a week or 2 weeks. But back then it was like parents were shipping you off for the summer and you were gone,
Right.
and I was there for 7 weeks. And one of the things that my parents told the head counselor they hoped I would do, I guess they thought I'd be good at it. They wanted me to get into theater. So they, at the camp, encouraged me to try out for plays. And the first play I tried out for was this odd thing I'd never heard of, but it was a stage adaptation of something called The Hobbit. And as it happened, I auditioned, and my parents, being smart and knowing me pretty well, knew I'd be pretty good. And I got the part of Bilbo Baggins in this camp production of The Hobbit. And I fell in love with the script. I mean, it was wild. It was crazy. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. And so I got back from camp, and as I say, I was 11, so I was just on the cusp of really starting to move into adolescence and be a terrible burden on my parents. But I was also looking for adventures and escapes and all of that. And so I started reading Tolkien, and then I moved on to Eddings, and I read Frank Herbert, and I read, in my later teen years, I read all of the Stephen R. Donaldson Covenant books, and just was having my mind open to this amazing new genre that for me it was new. Obviously it wasn't for other people, but I was fascinated by it, and it really was formative for me.
That's great. Bilbo Baggins as your first stage role. Yeah. So like after that, if you did more, everything was downhill. No, I'm just
Well, actually I did theater, so my first play back at home, I was Oliver in Oliver. And then I did theater all through junior high and high school. And I was, for 7 years of my life, theater was everything.
Wow.
And then I stopped doing it when I went to college because I discovered marijuana, and that was much more fun than the theater, and I didn't have to remember anything.
Exactly. Yeah. There are a few other distractions as well.
Exactly.
In college. So yeah, that's great. Now, speaking of college, how has your history background actually influenced your work, your writing career?
Well, that's a hard question. I went to college wanting to be a creative writing major, and kind of went to history because I got turned off by the creative writing program at my school for a number of reasons, and was convinced by some people that a history degree where I could teach and fall back on teaching instead of depending all on writing made more sense professionally. And for a long time, my history background helped me insofar as it taught me how to do research. And so when I was researching the medieval fantasies with which I started my career, the Lontobin Chronicle, Winds of the Four Winds, Blood of the Southlands, it was 11 books in total that I wrote in as an epic fantasist. And mostly they helped me with, as I say, research and knowing how to ask research questions and knowing how to make research a tool rather than a rabbit hole. And then right around that time, when I was finishing my last epic fantasy novel, I had the idea for the Thief Taker books, and ended up placing those in pre-revolutionary Boston. And so all of a sudden, my history background became not just a tutorial on how to do research, but this powerful informing tool for the story as I was writing. And so my relationship with my old history degree changed markedly when I started doing the Thief Taker books. And at this point, I've written 6 Thief Taker books, and including a short story collection and several other short stories that weren't in that collection. So I've done a lot in that world, and it's been fun mining that other side of my geekdom. You know, it's not just the fantasy love, but also the history love. But it really was. It took me going back to writing urban fantasy to get me to really use my degree.
Okay. Now, that's a good segue actually into my next question, which was that you did start your writing career, as you said, writing epic fantasy, more traditional. When people hear the word fantasy, they typically think of that type of fantasy.
Right.
And you know, so kind of give us a little bit of background on those series, kind of your elevator pitch for what those are about.
Okay. Wow. I haven't had to pitch those books in a long time.
Well, they're already out there and enjoyed and loved by many, but you know, just give us a little idea.
Yeah. So the first series, the Lon Tobin Chronicle, which really did launch my career. They were bought by Tor Books, and they ended up winning the Crawford Award as the best new work in fantasy. So they really did set me up, and it was a first contact story. 2 lands, one technological and one pastoral, but dependent on magic, kind of have their first contact, and it doesn't go well. And the magical hook in that series was that my mages formed psychic bonds with birds of prey who became their familiars, and they could not only draw magic from the hawks and owls and eagles with whom they bonded, but they could also, if they needed to, use them as spies and send their minds into the hawks so that while they were flying, they could see what the hawks were seeing. And I grew up a bird watcher. And so being able to, again, marrying my geeks together has always attracted me. And so I was able to work in this passion for birds that I've had since I was a little boy into my fiction. And it was great fun writing those books. And then the next 2 series, the Winds of the Forelands and Blood of the Southlands books, I was actually inspired by them. My wife and I were traveling while I was working on the second book in that first series, the Lon Tobin books. And we went to Wales and we toured all these castle ruins. We went to Conway and Beaumaris, and there was another one, I'm blanking on the name, but I fell in love with these gorgeous castles. Carnarvon, that was the other one. And while I was there, I said to my wife, next series I do, it's all going to be castles. It's all going to be castles. I'm going to write every there's going to be castles everywhere. And so I ended up writing this castle intrigue story about wars and an unsolved murder. And the basic conceit of the series was that there were 2 races trying to coexist in this land, and racial prejudice was a very formative theme of that series. But the magic in it was really fun. And those books, in many ways, I mean, I've done work since that I think is more sophisticated and better written and everything, but I view Winds of the Forelands as kind of my first opus. The Lon Tobin books were fine, but Winds of the Forelands is something I still look back on with tremendous pride. I love those books, and I have the rights back to them. I want to reissue them sometime soon.
Oh, great. Well, hear that, everybody who's watching this, they will be able to get versions of those that they maybe haven't already.
Yeah.
Great. Now, as you mentioned, that you after those, you did move into the Thief Taker Chronicles, and I have the first one here.
I love that
Which,
cover. I still love that
yes,
cover.
I know, I do too. And I remember that you were on a panel at Dragon Con many moons ago, and this is when it was still the, before urban fantasy and horror had split. It was the dark fantasy track,
Right.
and you were telling us about this series, and I just remember at the time thinking, oh my gosh, I cannot wait for this, because to me that, as you're saying, when you can kind of merge, two of your interests or two of your great passions or loves, it's great. It brings it out, and for me that's both history and urban fantasy. So as you know, I have been on board with this series from the very beginning,
Yes.
and love it dearly. But if there's anybody watching this who maybe hasn't read that series, what can you tell us about? Give us a little bit of a summary about this particular series.
Sure. So the basic the elevator pitch for this is it's Harry Dresden meets Samuel Adams. These are detective novels with a magical detective, and they're set in pre-revolutionary Boston. So every story, every book, every short piece of short fiction has some sort of mystery. Sometimes it's a murder, sometimes it's something else embedded in the background of an actual historical event. So, for instance, that first book that you just held up, Thief Taker, I insert a magical murder into the night of the Stamp Act riots. And so there were people abroad in the streets of Boston that night. They were rioting, they were burning the houses of Crown officials, and I add a murder to it and mix that murder in with the colonial politics. And that's sort of the formula that I use for each one of the books or stories. There is always an element of the politics of the time, the history of the time, and there's also something fictional, and invariably my hero, Ethan Cale, has to solve a magical murder while juggling the divided loyalties of the Boston populace and the Boston political structure. And so it blends all these things. I love these books. I really do. I think it was one of the most inspired series ideas I've ever had. And it mixes mystery and history and magic, and they're really fun. But the other thing that I think makes them work is Ethan himself. He's not a typical hero. He's not young and dashing and kind of your rough and ready hero. He's been through stuff. He has served time in a British penal colony in Barbados for mutiny aboard a ship, and at that time he lost part of his foot to gangrene after an accident in the sugar fields. And he's been through a lot. He's seen a lot. He has suffered a lot, and there is, I think, a grittiness to him and an almost washed and worn quality to him that I wanted in the books because they mirror the history of Boston at that time. Boston in the early 1700s was the queen city of the colonies. And by the 1760s, when I'm writing, it's kind of been eclipsed by New York and Philadelphia. And it's a rough town, and it has a lot of crime, and it has a real seedy dark side that, as I say, mirrors Ethan's life and Ethan's arc. And I feel like the elements of the Thief Taker story just came together in so many different ways. And that's why I keep on going back to the series. I've written more books in it. I write a short story in the Thief Taker world almost every single year, at least one. And so I want to keep those books alive, and I want to go back and do more with them. And yeah, I really enjoy them.
Well, those of us who are fans are very glad that you do. And can you also tell us about what a thief taker actually is? The historical context.
Sure. I should have let off with that.
Okay.
So a thief taker was basically a private detective, someone who would recover stolen items and, if possible, catch the thief who pinched them, for a fee, as a private investigator. And thief takers existed in the absence of an established police force. And so they were very big in early 18th century England, and particularly in London. They existed very briefly in some cities in the New World, actually at the beginning of the 19th century. There were no thief takers in Boston, as actual fact. There were none. That's a historical conceit of the series. But the idea of having thief takers in Boston at that time works because it was such a seedy town and a rough town, and because Boston relied on basically one man. His name was Stephen Greenleaf, and he was the sheriff of Suffolk County. And he and basically some men of the night watch who he managed to hire, who tended to be less than competent and less than honest, were the only people keeping the peace in the city. And so thief takers could very well have thrived in Boston at that time. The most famous thief taker, and there's a reason I'm telling you this, was a man named Jonathan Wild, who existed in Boston, who had this checkered, meteoric career. And he came to fame by running a criminal enterprise where he would have men in his employ steal things, and then he would return them to their owners for the fee as the thief taker, and convince everyone that he was a genius, that he could solve any crime because he was responsible for every crime. And he had this incredible career and then was hanged at the ripe old age of 27. Jonathan Wild is the historical model for Sapphira Price, who is the crooked, seductive, wonderful nemesis for Ethan in the Thief Taker books. And she runs the Boston streets the way Jonathan Wild ran the London streets. And she and Ethan spar throughout the Thief Taker series, and their relationship is one that's fraught with tension and really bitter enmity, and yet also grudging respect, and on some level for both of them, this very subtle sexual attraction. And it's been a really fun relationship to write.
Yeah, she is a great antagonist. I don't want to call her a villain, even though she, pretty much is. But yes, she's a great antagonist in that series for sure. Now, after the Thief Taker books, you moved on to you haven't left them completely, but after the 4 books of the series were completed, you moved on to contemporary urban fantasy with the Case Files of Justice Fearson. Here's the first one of those.
Right.
And that one, can you tell our viewers a little bit about what that is about? And this series has a very unique magical price that is paid by the main character and other characters / practitioners. But
yeah, so actually, I started publishing the Fearson series while I was still publishing the first 4 books of the Thief Taker series. There was a brief period there where I had a book coming out from Tor and from Baen.
Oh, they crossed over a little bit.
6 months. Which was really fun. Although a little bit like working for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party at the same time. So the Justice Fearson series, as you say, it's a contemporary urban fantasy, and in many ways there are similarities. I think you could look at Justice Fearson as someone who has followed very naturally in the progression of my writing from Ethan. Ethan could very well be Justice Fearson's ancestor. But the magic system is based on the cycles of the moon, and Justice Fearson is what I call a weir mist. And every full moon, his magic intensifies, but with that intensification comes temporary insanity. And slowly, over the years, all those moon phasings are causing him to grow gradually insane, which is what happened to his father, who was also a weir mist. And so we have in his father this kind of template for what's going to happen to justice. We're seeing his descent into madness in slow motion, and a lot of the series is about him grappling with that future and dealing with his dad, but also solving crimes. And he was on the police force for a while, but he was kicked off because every month for 3 nights at a time he was going on what seemed to his colleagues to just be a bender, when in fact he was suffering from these moon phasings. And I love those books. I absolutely adore the Justice Fearson books. They never caught on quite the way I hoped they would. But I've been in discussions with folks at Baen about possibly bringing out those first 3 books in an omnibus, and I've written a couple of short stories in that world. So I hold out hope that at some point I can return to Justice Fearson and do some more books, because I loved them. I love the series. I love the relationship between Justice and his dad. And there's a romance in there that is also difficult, but very touching at times. And that romance has always been fun to write. In many ways, the humor between them and the dynamic between them is very similar to that between my wife and me. And so that was fun to write as well. And so, yeah, I'd love to go back and work on Justice Fearson some more.
Well, and one thing that I'm curious about is that series is set in Arizona. And I'm just wondering why you chose that as a setting. I mean, it works well, but I was just, it's an interesting choice for the setting.
Yeah, it is. And it's it's one of those things. It's almost vestigial. It's like the inflamed appendix of the series. So part of it is I love that part of the country. I've traveled there a lot. I've spent a lot of time there, and I've camped there a lot. So I love it. And writing about it has always been really fun. Part of it was that the original incarnation of the first book of that series, the magic system was dependent on something that I had growing in the desert, a form of lichen that fueled the insanity. Or not fueled it, excuse me, that could control the insanity. It later became just a medication he could take. But for a while, it was this. And that element of the magic system never worked. And so in one of the many rewrites I did of Spellblind before it finally came out, I changed the magic system to accommodate a simpler, more direct magical reality. And it has worked much better. The books were much better for that rewrite. But at that point, I had set the books in Phoenix, and I wasn't about to rewrite all of that stuff. I had done tremendous amounts of research on the Phoenix Police Department, on the kind of crime landscape in the city, and what sections of the city you wanted to live in and which ones you didn't, and which ones Justice would have patrolled as a cop when he was still on the beat, and all of that stuff. And I wasn't about to undo all that work. So the reason for setting it in Phoenix, the main reason, disappeared long ago. but there the books remain.
Right. Well, and that makes a lot of sense, because you would have had to change an awful lot if and not only remove things, you'd have to add something in. And yes, I can see where that would have been a little time consuming. Yes. You would have been spending all your time doing that instead of actually writing the stories themselves, right?
Yeah, I would have. And I feel like some of what makes that series work is that I feel that I did a really nice job realizing the desert environment,
yes,
and making that part of the narrative, and also weaving in elements of the Native American culture that relate to the ghost that Justice relies upon for help in his magical training. And so it would have involved changing so much that it really would have gutted elements of the series that I wouldn't have wanted to take out.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, sometime after that, well, the book came out after the Fearson books had come out, but you got to do a tie-in for the Nightfall series. Now, and this was not your first experience doing a tie-in. You had done the Robin Hood back in, I believe, 2010.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
I'm curious, because I know several folks who have done these tie-in novels for different, or the official ones for different properties. And I'm curious how you got involved in these projects, and how did that process work for you?
So with the Robin Hood book, it was simply a matter of Tor books. I was still with Tor at the time. This was in between. I did the Robin Hood, as you say, it was 2010, so it was in between Blood of the Southlands and Thief Taker. And my editor at the time at Tor was the acquiring editor for the Robin Hood project, which meant that Tor, along with several other publishers, put in a bid for with NBC Universal to try to get the rights to do this book, and Tor won the sweepstakes, essentially.
Oh.
And my editor he hadn't told me this, but when he was putting in the bid, he was already thinking of me for the book because of the historical element, because it was going to read like a medieval fantasy in certain ways. And so he thought that with my history background and my experience at that point, 11 books of epic fantasy, I would be a good person to write the book. And so it kind of fell into my lap. He called me like the Tuesday before Thanksgiving that year and said, look, this is in the works. And if it happens, the turnaround time is incredibly quick. So you're going to need to drop anything else you're doing and do this. You have a 6-week window to write a 90,000 word novel.
During the holidays at
During
that.
the holidays, yes. The book was due January 1st. And then, he called me the day after Thanksgiving. He called me Black Friday and he said, we got the book. I'm sending you the script. I'm sending you all the background material. Get to work.
Jeez, that was a busy year, wasn't it?
It really was. It was quite incredible. At some point, when you and I are not on the air and are in a bar somewhere and having a beer, I can tell you some stories from that experience, but they're not stories I should probably share widely at this point. Anyway, and then the Nightfall series, it was a somewhat similar experience, except it was my agent who got it for me. Nightfall was looking for a writer, and my agent, the marvelous Lucienne Diver, came to me and she said, look, this is out there. I think you'd be perfect for it. I've already floated your name with them. They've seen your resume. They've seen some of your older work. They're interested. Would you like to do this? And it was, writing the Nightfall book was tremendous fun. I really enjoyed it. And one of the reasons I enjoyed it was they sent me all the material I could want, and then they gave me tremendous amounts of freedom. They basically said, here's the series. There's an opening scene in the very first episode of the series that takes place like 20 years before the rest of the series takes place. We want you to fit this novel into that 20-year gap. So as long as you keep all the major characters alive and don't do anything crazy with them, you can do whatever you want with this story.
Wow.
And it was really fun. They had some suggestions of things they wanted me to do, but they gave me a lot of latitude. They were fun to work with. They liked the innovations I brought to it. At one point, I use a kind of an unconventional character as a point of view character, and those chapters worked really well, and they loved it. So that was the Nightfall series, or the Nightfall book, was a really fun project, and I wish the series for History Channel had done better, because I would have loved to have done another Nightfall book, but they only got two seasons out of the series, right. And the second season didn't do all that well, and so they canceled the series, and I didn't have an opportunity to do anything more with it. But that was a fun project. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, we watched it here. And when I saw that you had done the tie-in, but I thought that's incredible. That's, I was like, I know him.
Well, so the funny thing, Carol, is that I started writing as D.B. Jackson for the Thief Taker books because Tor didn't want to affect my brand. I was an epic fantasy writer, and they wanted me to keep the epic fantasy and the historical separate. So D.B. Jackson was going to be the historical guy. And that's why I wrote the Thief Taker books as D.B. Jackson. Well, by the time I got the assignment to write Nightfall, I was doing an epic fantasy series as D.B. Jackson. And so the History Channel wanted me to do the history stuff as David B. Coe. So I've totally...
Yeah. And that's actually a very nice segue into my next question, which is about the Isle Vale series, which I have an e-copy of, so I can't hold it up and show everybody. But tell us a little bit about that one and how that all came.
Yeah, it's epic fantasy time travel, and the way the magic works is my time traveler, he can go back in time, and then he or she, because there are a couple of them, they can go back in time and then they can return to their present. But if they go back in time a year, they age that year. And if they return to their present, coming forward a year, they age another year. So every time you move through time, you're spending that amount of your life. And my character starts as a 15-year-old. My protagonist starts as a 15-year-old, as does the person he ends up traveling through time with. And they go back 14 years. So they arrive as 29-year-olds, although with the emotions and thought processes still of kids. And they're thrown into an assassination plot. They have to care for the orphaned infant princess of a king. And it's a wild ride that they go on. Those books are probably, the first book certainly is the best reviewed book I've ever written.
Wow.
It got rave reviews. It was named the best fantasy novel of 2018 by Reviews and Robots over in the UK. Got a starred review from Publishers Weekly. It was, and I love those books. I mean, I say this about all my books. I love all my books. I really do. I am passionate about all my books.
Well, that's good.
But the time travel books, I feel, were the most challenging and most ambitious projects I've ever taken on. And I feel that I met the ambition in the execution of the series. And that is an incredibly satisfying feeling.
Right. Well, if you feel as though you've accomplished what you wanted to,
yeah,
that's always a good feeling no matter what. But for an author, I'm sure it especially is.
Yeah. And they're big, thick books. I couldn't outline them. For some reason, they just resisted every attempt to outline them. So I wrote by the seat of my pants 3 huge novels with time travel in them, which was no picnic. And those books, as I say, they were the hardest thing I've ever worked on. I've never struggled with books like I struggled with those, but they came out really well.
Well, if it all ended up being worth it, then that's good for you and for your readers.
Yep.
Well, the next thing that you did, or the next series, was your Radiance series, which is really more science fiction than some of your other work has been, or that most of your other work has been. And what can you tell us about that duology?
Yeah, these books, I'm hoping there'll be more of them. They're supernatural. I call them supernatural thrillers. But you're right, they have a science fiction-y element to them because the power, kind of the mental kinesis that my characters possess, they draw upon the energy systems that keep the Earth rotating and keep the moon orbiting the Earth. And so they draw on planetary systems for the energy that they possess. In both books, my lead characters are young adults. So it has a young adult feel to it. Both books do. I keep on wanting to say I love these books, but I don't want to say that because I say that about everything. But I really do love these books. The second book, Invasives, I wrote during a really difficult period that my family was going through. And that book, to me, it means more to me than almost any other book I've ever written, because at the time I wrote it, I didn't know if I could get through it. I was going through such a difficult time that I just wanted to jettison everything. I didn't want to work on anything. I wanted to wallow in what we were going through. But I didn't. I wrote that book, and that book saved me. Because if I had given in to the impulse, I don't know where I'd be right now. But instead, I threw myself into that book and loved the way it came out, but also loved what it did for me, and allowing me to channel emotions into a different direction. The book doesn't deal with the issues I was dealing with at the time, but the emotion in the book comes across in a really raw, visceral, powerful way, I think, in part because I was channeling all this stuff I was going through into this book. And so that second book, Invasives, is about a group of homeless teens who live in the subway tunnels underneath New York City, and who stumble across a financial scandal, a scheme, and become targets of the people who are perpetrating this scheme. And so it really does have the flavor of a thriller, much more than anything else I've written. And that dynamic among the three teens was really fun to work on. And I drew a lot in both Radiance and Invasives. I drew a lot on the relationship between my two daughters, and
okay.
the teasing and the dynamics of the sister-brother relationship in the first book, and these three teens who are living together in the tunnels in the second book. A lot of that is colored by what I have seen in my daughters as they have loved and fought and loved some more and just dealt with each other, and so that makes those books really special to me.
You can relive their teenage years by
pretty much, you know. Yeah.
Now, when you look back at any of your books, who have been some of your secondary or your favorite secondary, or maybe recurring? Maybe it's somebody that's not a true secondary character, but who pops back into series. Who has been your favorite to write?
Well, Sapphira Price, definitely in the Thief Taker books, and also the secondary characters in the Thief Taker books I like a lot. There's Diver Jervis, who is Ethan's closest friend, and he's kind of a kid he's a ne'er-do-well. He's always in trouble, but his heart's in the right place. And I put him through some pretty serious stuff during the course of the Thief Taker books. I do some very mean things to Diver. And Jana Windcatcher, who is the other sorcerer in Boston, Ethan's mentor in a way. She's a real fun character, but certainly Sapphira would be foremost. And then let's see, that's a interesting. Oh, well, okay. And then in the Islevale books, the time demon Droey is just a wonderful character to write. She is acerbic, but also deeply curious about the world. And so time demons manifest as human children. That's what they look like. And they prey on people, basically. They take people's years to survive. And so they're creatures of prey, and they're killers, and they're dangerous. And yet Droey, while being this essentially, monster in a child's body, also has a real human side to her, that made her tremendous fun to write. I think she is, for many people who read that series, she's the character they fixate on, because her storyline is a pretty central one. She's a secondary character in a way, but she's really, really close to the surface in that series. And she's on the cover of the second book, and that cover of the second book is magnificent. And so I really love her. And I actually wrote I have a short story about her that was in an anthology several years back. So I've dipped into her backstory a little bit, and she's another one who I just adore. And then the newest thing that I'm working on, which I know you intend to ask me about it.
Yes, I will. Yeah.
But I have a new series, and there are some characters in the new series who are really, really fun to write. So secondary characters.
Great. Well, and those are always fun because they do help flesh out a story, and it gives, it takes a little bit of heat, should I say, off of your main protagonist, both for you as the author and for the reader as well. So yeah, that when those are well done, it serves everybody.
Yeah, and actually,
It's a bonus.
talking about it, I mean, this makes me want to. I'm going to thank you. You've just inspired me for a blog post I'm going to write early in the new year, because the other thing to my mind that secondary characters do is they can be vehicles for world building and
Mhm.
conveying the background of the world in a way that maybe a primary character can't be, because you don't want to get in the way of the main plot line and the narrative and the character development of those essential characters. And the secondary characters allow you to play a little more and show the underbelly of the world a little bit more. And so they serve a purpose in that way as well.
True. I hadn't really thought about that, but now I have a picture of a dog laying on its back and showing how underbelly. Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
Uh, now, from your perspective, who do you think that for both Ethan and Jay, or Justice, he
Mhm.
goes by Jay in the books, but
Yeah.
who was the most dangerous foe that they've ever faced?
Hmm. So for Ethan, it would have to be Nate Ramsey,
Mm,
the villain in the latter half of the original Thief Taker series. And I don't want to say too much about him, but he was a powerful conjurer, and so a worthy opponent for Ethan. But he was brilliant and charming and just unhinged enough to be truly dangerous, right? I
yeah.
mean, a true crazy person is often undone by their own madness. Nate Ramsey was just sane enough to be truly dangerous and just unhinged enough to be truly deadly. And he was the best villain I think I pitted Ethan against. Although there's some later villains in a couple of the short stories I've written who haven't come into any of them, who came into the Thief Taker novel that came out last summer, the Loyalist Witch.
Oh,
The
okay.
title character in that, she was very dangerous as well. Um, and then for Justice Fearson, I'd say it was Saoirse, the uh,
Hmm.
the the witch, the sorceress who plagues Justice over the second and third books in the series, and who is capable of entering his mind and speaking to him and manipulating him, while also just unleashing torrents of really dark magic on the world. And she embodies all the villains that I threw at Ethan. Yes, at Ethan in a way. I took her and put her into Jay's world, and she's part Saphira Price, and she's part Nate Ramsey, and she's part this monster from another realm, and she was a good villain.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, about her being that kind of a combination, but you're right. That fits perfectly. She's a scary lady, no doubt.
Yeah, yes, she is. She is. Yeah.
Now, what would you say that the major personality differences? What are the major personality differences between Ethan and Jay, and how are they most alike?
That's a really good question. Um, I think the main differences are tied to their age. Ethan's
Mm,
older; he's seen more of life, he's suffered more, and B, that he really has had a very rough life. I think Jay and Ethan, as young men, were very, very similar. And then Ethan went to prison for 14 years, and he came out a very different creature. And a lot of the roughness in Ethan, the callousness, the difficulty, even in sharing emotions with the love of his life, his sense of isolation. He has no family who he's close to, at least nobody who's proximate to him in Boston. Aside from a couple of friends and his love, Kanice, he's incredibly isolated. And I think that Jay is a more social creature, and I think he's younger. Life hasn't treated him great. He has scars from his mother's death. He has scars from the loss of a job that he loved, to this psychological curse that he inherited from his father. But I think he's softer in a way, and he's also, I think, more naive in a way. And I think his naivete gets him in trouble at times in ways that Ethan would have been suspicious from the start, because he's just cynical enough to know that, nothing good is going to come of X. And Jay maybe was willing to believe that, something good could come. Oh no, nothing's good.
Yeah. Yeah, by the third book, he does stop himself occasionally, but yeah, he's a bit more impulsive, is he not?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I really do think in many ways it's a foible of youth and a softer life.
Yeah, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, which aspect of both the Thief Taker and Case Files series did you most enjoy writing? Was it the characters? Was it the world building? Was it the magic system?
This is one of those answers that's utterly frustrating for someone in your position, but I find it very hard to separate the elements out. I think when books work, and I think I've been fortunate with both those series, that the books all at this point, 9 of the books really do work. They work because there is a synergy among the various narrative elements, the plotting, the character work, the world building. It all comes together really well. That said, the scenes in which I've been able to chart the growth of Ethan's relationship with Saphira were really fun to write. And because they start off in the first book, they're just enemies. They just hate each other. And by the 4th book, they have reached an accommodation that nobody reading the first book probably would have predicted, but any person reading all the books can trace and see that it makes sense.
Right. Yes.
And then for the Fearson, I'd say it's the relationship between Jay and his dad. I lost my father a long time ago. I lost him back when I was writing the Juan Tobin books. So at the very beginning of my career, he knew that I had signed a contract with Tor Books, and he knew the book was coming out in the spring, but he didn't live to see it. And we had lost my mother a couple of years before, and she, at the end of her life, suffered from dementia. And so the relationship between Jay and his dad, the closeness, the love, but also dealing with his father's psychotic swings, really carries elements of my relationship with both my parents. And I adored my parents and was very close to them throughout the time we had together. And so being able to revisit that and being able to create on the page relationship that really does mine those emotions and those histories, that was very satisfying. So it's a different, the Ethan Saphira stuff is kind of, those are the fun chapters in those books, and the scenes with Jay and his dad are some of the more difficult, moving and hard to read chapters, but they really were the ones those were the relationships that were the most satisfying to write in those 2 series.
Well, and they balance each other out.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. I think that those were the most satisfying for you. as the creator.
Right.
And do you have a favorite installment from each of those series? Was there one book in particular from either one that you particularly either enjoyed the writing of or the final product?
Right. For Fearson, I think each book got better. So I think Spellblind's a good book. I think His Father's Eyes is a better book. I think Shadow's Blade is one of the best things I've ever written. So I really love Shadow's Blade.
Okay.
The relationship among all the characters in that, and the evolution of Jay's magic, which at the end of that book really reaches a new level and enables him to prevail. I love that book a lot, and I'm very proud of it. And then the Thief Taker books, again, I think the first one is good. It's a solid book. I think in many ways, I love Dead Man's Reach, but Thieves' Quarry, the second book in the series, is when I really started doing stuff with Ethan and with Saphira and with Kanice and with all the characters that I hadn't been ready to attempt in the first book. And I think Thieves' Quarry, in many ways, is the freshest and most satisfying read of those four. And I mean, I say this and it sounds really conceited. I think that's a high bar. I think all four books are really good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very proud of all those books. But Thieves' Quarry, I love that book. And when at one point when it might have been when we were auditioning for the Nightfall and they wanted to see a writing sample, that was the book we sent. We didn't send them the first one. We sent them Thieves' Quarry. And I got the gig, so they must have liked it.
There you go. So somebody else agreed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now I know that that Ethan did do something like this, but if Ethan and or Jay, so you can pick either one, could make a guest appearance in another series by another author, which one would it be? Who do you think they would fit well with? Or not, and there would be chaos would ensue, whatever.
Have you read, I mean, I'm sure you have, but Katie Murphy's Negotiator series?
I've read the first one just recently,
Murphy.
Actually. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a series. I think they're set in New York City, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the magic system is very cool, and the lead character is just wonderful. And Katie is a good friend and a marvelous writer. She's one of those writers who I read, and I think as I'm reading, I can learn craft just by reading this woman's work. She's so good. She's just so good. And she and I actually for a little while entertained the idea of doing a crossover with either Ethan or Jay in that world. And it's something, she's moved on to other stuff and I've moved on to other stuff. But I know if I were to, ply her with Guinnesses and sit her down in a bar, I could get her to agree to do something. So
there you go. Good luck.
Yeah. But yeah, so I would love to do something with her in her world.
Oh, that would be, yeah. I'm just, since I read that Heart of Stone just recently, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, how would that work? But yeah, that would be very intriguing.
Heart of Stone. I'm trying to remember the other two titles. I have them behind me somewhere in that, but there they are. Right. Heart of Stone, Hands of Flame, and House of Cards. And it is one of the best urban fantasy trilogies I have ever read. And I've read a lot of urban fantasy. I love those books. She is just such a talented writer. And that magic system blew my mind. Just great stuff.
Well, there's a good plug for someone else as well. And so, but yes, I have, before I get to trying to pick your brain about what we, what's coming next, I know a little bit about it, but I want everybody to hear about it. As far as a kind of a craft question goes, just because I think it's kind of interesting that people have different responses to this. When you're writing, do you need absolute quiet, or do you like some kind of background sound, or does it vary depending upon what you're writing?
It varies by project. I generally I can't edit. I do some editing as for anthologies and also as a freelance editor. And I can't edit to music at all. I need silence for that. But for writing, I love improvisational instrumental music. So I listen to either bluegrass or jazz. I just wrote a dragon story for a dragon anthology, and for some reason, I listened to bluegrass for that one, and I wrote the story in 4 days. So apparently, the music worked. And it was a really fun story too. But for other stuff, I need to listen to jazz and something a little, I don't know, just deeper, different mood, a bluer mood. The interesting thing, so I can't listen to music that has lyrics or someone singing. That messes me up. But I mentioned before that I couldn't outline the Isle Vale books, and I couldn't, for some reason, listen to jazz or bluegrass when I was writing them. And I think it was a combination. I think it was the same dynamic at work, although I haven't quite put it to words yet. But the music I listened to for that was classical. And I think something about having structured music, not improvisational music, helped me get over the fact that I wasn't able to outline those books.
Oh, that makes sense, though. Yeah. So it was kind of subconsciously providing that structure for you that you couldn't get on your own, that you couldn't quite get to work. So
exactly.
That's great. Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, you have something very exciting coming up next. So what can you tell us about your next work that we are going to be looking for from you?
So the next work is a urban fantasy trilogy, steeped in Celtic lore. It's set in our world, and the first book is, so the books are called the Chalice War, and the first book is Stone. And basically the idea is the four magical artifacts from Celtic mythology: the Stone of Fall, the Sword of Nuadu, the Spear of Lugh, and the Cauldron of Dagda, are the chalices of magic in our world. And if you remove those, or if they're stolen by the Fomor and taken back to the Underrealm, all magic goes out of our world, and our world lies unprotected from the demons of the underworld. And so each book is about protecting one of those artifacts. And the first book takes place in the States. The second one is set in Australia, where I lived for a year. And the third one is set in Ireland, which I visited back in 2019 when Worldcon was held in Dublin.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
And so the books, they're high stakes books. There's a lot of fraught stuff. Bad things happen to good people, all of that. But there's also a tremendous amount of humor. And so the Morrigan, the Fates, are these are the battle furies who can not the Fates, the battle furies, who can turn themselves into a winged horse and giant ravens, and who feed on strife and all of this, and appear as hags and all that. In my book, they are also nightclub singers in Las Vegas. And
which I guess fits.
And Manannán Ben Locke, who is a sea god, and who wields tremendous power, is, in my book, a parrot head. He looks like a Jimmy Buffett fan.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And so there's all this interaction between humans and the gods, and those interactions are dangerous and difficult, but also really, really funny. And it was such a fun set of books to write. I wrote the first one a dozen years ago, in the middle of the summer before. The summer before I wrote Robin Hood, I was in between contracts and I didn't have anything to write. And I wrote the first book in this series, although I didn't realize it at the time. I just wrote a book that I thought would be fun to write. and then I put it away, and I've gone back to it several times and rewritten it, and it's been through, this is probably the 6th or 7th iteration. But after writing Radiance for Bellbridge Books, my editor there asked me what else I had, and I basically said, well, I have a Celtic mythology epic of urban fantasy, and before I could get any more out, she just said, yes, please. So
That's
the first
great.
book will be out in February. The second book will be out in March. The third book, I believe, will be out in May. So we're doing.
Well, now that's perfect, because people don't have to wait forever to get the next one. So
yeah,
that's great. That's great. Well, you heard it here, folks. You don't have to wait too long in between, because I know that's a major concern for people. But anyway, that's awesome. That sounds great. I know that I will be looking forward to them, and I'm sure that everyone listening to this will be as well. But
well,
David, thank you so much for taking the time, especially during this time of year, to sit down and answer 20 questions, essentially. And I really appreciate it. And I'm sure all of your the viewers of this I'm hoping that anyone who watched this that maybe isn't familiar with your work will now be going out and getting plenty of books in time for the holidays as well. So
I want to thank you for making the time for me and giving me the opportunity to speak with you. It's always a pleasure talking to you anyway, but this was a lot of fun, and I so appreciate it.
Well, you are more than welcome, and many thanks to everyone who will be tuning in to watch this video whenever that happens to be. Stay tuned for another. I don't have an exact date and everything yet, but I do have something coming up in January. Another author interview, and then at the end of the month, on the 26th, we will have our Buffy Watch season 4 discussion panel. So that will be coming up as well. But thank you, David. Thank you to our viewers. Everyone have an absolutely wonderful holiday season.
Yes, happy holidays all.
Yes, and we hope to see everyone at either one of these virtual panels or in person at DragonCon. Thanks again. And adios, everybody.